Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online exhibition opening and program titled Imaginary Books, Lost, Unfinished, and Fictive Works Found Only in Other Books. And thank you for joining us here in the club rooms and for joining us online. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all and host this program this evening. Tonight, we have a little more than 200 people registered to join us on Zoom and about 50 people registered to join us here in person. So I think we got a pretty good turnout tonight, Reid. For those of you that are new to the Book Club of California, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal and member newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We also host this year-round series of programs and exhibitions, like the one this evening, on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online and find out more at bccbooks.org. Or you can talk to me after tonight's program if you're here in the club rooms. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program, again, is titled Imaginary Books, Lost, Unfinished, and Fictive Works Found Only in Other Books. And our presenter is Reid Byers. Now, Reid Byers is an author, a collector, and a curator. He serves as the president of the Baxter Society, the Bibliophilic Association of Northern New England. He is the author of The Private Library, honored as one of the best nonfiction books of 2021 by the Washington Post. His current book, Imaginary Books, Lost, Unfinished, and Fictive Works Found Only in Other Books, is published by Oak Knoll, and it is the subject of the exhibition opening tonight here at the book club, which comes to us after recently being on view at the Grolier Club in New York. Now, I'm not going to steal his thunder and tell you all about the exhibition. I'm going to let him reveal it all to you in just a moment. We are going to have a short lecture tonight. It won't be a full hour because we want to make sure if you're here in the club rooms, you have time to see the exhibition if you haven't already kind of taken a look at it. And we do want to take some questions from you here in the club rooms and from folks on Zoom. So if you're joining us on Zoom, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions on Zoom, and I'll come back at the end to help curate a little Q&A with our speaker in about a half hour or so. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, author, collector, and curator, Reid Byers.
Thank you, Kevin, for your kind introduction, and thank you for all your help in arranging this event and also for putting it together once it got here. I would also like to thank Jake for 100 little things that he did to help with this, and my hosts, Bruce and Mary Crawford, for making this escapade possible. And especially, I want to thank Shira Buxbaum, who is here. She is the director of exhibitions at the Grolier Club in New York, and she came along because she knew I couldn't manage this myself. And I'm very, very grateful for that. Yes, that would be very nice. Thanks. Before I show some of the highlights from this exhibition, I would like to explain a little bit of the background because it is perhaps somewhat unusual. And my first, I'm getting a little feedback, Kevin. My first experience of an imaginary book came in my childhood reading. I was reading one of C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, traveling to the island of the Dufflepuds and finding the magician's house. And there I followed Lucy Pevensey as she climbed the great silent staircase and she crept down the long, ever lengthening hall to the last door on the left, which was the magician's library. And there she discovered his magic book lying on its desk. As Lucy began reading the spells and the stories, I was enchanted right along with her. I wanted that imaginary book even more than I had wanted the brand new Narnia book that I was holding in my hands, which was fairly magical itself. And I remember a physical ache of longing for that imaginary book. It was a painful desire that I still occasionally encounter, though seldom with that much force. At the same time, I felt a great joy in the idea of this magical book, and the two feelings struggled for the mastery. On the one hand, the intense desire for the imaginary and the ache of the impossibility of having it. I do not recall whether I initially twigged that in the magician's book, Lewis was figuring the Bible, or that in the Narnia stories, he was representing the Christian kerygma. But I am certain that at that moment, I learned much of what I know of the love of books, and more than I ever want to know about the lust for the unobtainable. Imaginary books do not exist in our sublunary world. And yet the collection on exhibition here presents a broad range of such books. It is offered as a book exhibition, but it has been better described as a post-structuralist conceptual art installation. It could also be called a Wunderkammer or a Gesamtkunstwerk, which it is, or a sort of Byzantine jeu d'esprit, but it is at heart a bibliophilic entertainment. In the encyclopedia, Diderot and D'Alembert divided these books into three standard categories. Lost books, Diderot's Livres Perdus, books that once existed but with no surviving examples. All copies destroyed or misplaced, there are very many of them. Unfinished books, Diderot's Livres Promis, books that were begun in some fashion but were never completed or brought to publication. Diderot called them promised books, but unfinished or abandoned books might be a better description. And then there are fictive books, livres imaginaires, that is, books that only exist in story and have no physical form of existence whatsoever. These are books not written themselves, but books written about in other books. This exhibition has been selected from a substantial library of these imaginary critters, and the 100-odd volumes on show here have been chosen to present to the public, in many cases for the very first time, some of the very greatest non-existent works of literature. Central to the exhibition is the idea of the liminal moment. In anthropology, the liminal, from limen, the threshold, in anthropology, it refers to the time when a youth is being initiated into a tribe, and it's a period of a few hours or days when the normal rules of conduct do not apply. In story and theater, the liminal moment occurs when a threshold is crossed from one world into another, usually from the normal into the magical. It's the moment of falling down the rabbit hole or stumbling through the wardrobe. An encounter with an imaginary book brings us forcibly to a liminal moment. We're confronted with an object that we know does not exist, it's not there, but then it leaves us suspended in this strange space, in this liminal space, because being magical, the book is not to be touched. It is held in existence in the exhibition by a carefully balanced ontological tension, and for technical thaumaturgical reasons, it cannot be opened. It appears before us to amuse, to prompt a gasp or a knowing chuckle, or the briefest thought of, oh, how I wish. Now, the experience of an imaginary book is intended to amuse, but it can be caustically satiric, or it can be dramatically aesthetic. It always inspires reflection. What difference would it make if we could open these books? Would we laugh differently if we knew what Aristotle had thought was funny? What if young Karl Marx had finished the comedy he started? What function does an imaginary book serve in its story? And what does that tell us about our world? The books can raise serious questions for their would-be reader. Now, collectors have often asked me where the books have come from. The best answer I can give, I think, is that they were assembled by following the trails of the great collectors of the imaginary. So Max Beerbohm, James Branch Cabell, seeking out treasures in bookshop and attic and auction in that strange area bounded by Avalon and Phaeacia and seacoast Bohemia, and on the west, of course, by the Hesperides. These are shops not normally found on the maps of dealers in used and rare books. Occasionally, in the case of the more exotic items, it was necessary to stray even further afield, and some of the books could only be obtained at the great fair of Amalcara in Arabia Felix, which, to avoid the great heat of the sun, is kept in the night and by the light of the moon. One indeed was only to be had by barter in the denser and more inaccessible parts of Menyong's jungle, and so was only able to be retrieved for the collection by a hasty expedition involving a seaplane, an improvised palanquin, and a Melchizedek bottle of Veuve Clicquot. That's me on the right, preparing for the expedition to Menyong's jungle. Most imaginary books, and fictive books in particular, share an attribute that Stéphane Maheu calls a roman porteur, a carrier novel, the bearing book, the carrying book, the real book in which the imaginary book first appears. I call such a work the book of origin. So the crime wave at Blandings is of course the book of origin for Whiffle's wonderful book on the pig. In the case of lost or promised books, the book of origin is usually a history, could be a bibliography, could be a work of criticism. In the case of the fictive book, the book of origin is always a story. It could be a novel, it can be a drama, but it always comes from a story. That's the book of origin is where the imaginary touches our reality. Now, I need to be very clear. These are all real imaginary books. None of them has been invented by me. Each one really appears in a properly identified book of origin, most of which are themselves real as well. In the rare case when the book of origin is an imaginary book, that book is a real imaginary book with a book of origin of its own that we can identify. I am not making this up, you know. Liminality is sometimes seen as a dangerous state, both for the initiate and for the community. It represents a period when the normal rules of conduct are suspended. Similarly, it is a perilous position for the collector. My great-great-granduncle Fortsas had a strict rule of destroying any of his books that he discovered, for which he discovered the existence of a second copy. I have tried to go him one better. I destroy any book in my collection that is found to exist at all. And on more than one occasion, I have had to do that. The catalog to this exhibition, available at Oak Knoll Press, is presumably to be found in the library, either at Library of Congress Z1024 or at Dewey 11.7 under Imaginary Books. This is a very misleading locator. Sadly, it does not point to the location of any imaginary books, only to books about imaginary books. And where the imaginary book itself is intended to be shelved is completely unclear. The Club Fortsas in Paris has devised, has finessed the problem by giving a separate room to Uncle's collection. So the only cataloging number used is the original acquisition number that he used in the famous catalogue. Now, before we look at highlights, I am directed that I must read this warning, so forgive me. The difficulties associated with exhibiting a non-existent collection cannot easily be overstated. In addition to the purely ontological considerations involved, the mechanics of presenting to the public a series of objects that cannot possibly be on display present a broad spectrum of curatorial challenges, only some of which have been overcome. So here are a few of the books that I invite you to examine more closely, but I would like to point out. This is the first book in the collection, and it is Peripoetekes Ho Aristoteles Perites Commodias, the lost second book of Aristotle's Poetics. The first book is the earliest surviving work on dramatic theory, and it dealt with tragedy. The lost volume was comedy. The two books together had an incalculable effect on theater practice in the West, but the second book is lost. The last copy was burned in a monastery fire in the Piedmont in 1327. This was printed in Constantinople by Nicodemus Metaxas. It contains a nice Latin translation and a commentary on the Greek text by Antonio Montecatini. I'm probably not giving anything away if I say that this is the book that causes all the trouble in the Name of the Rose. Homer, the Margites. Homer wrote 3 great poems. This is not widely known. He wrote tragedy in the Iliad, and he wrote an epic in the Odyssey, and he wrote a comedy, the Margites, which was his first one. It is the story of the eponymous bonehead Margites, of whom Plato said, he knew many things, but all badly. Aristotle loved the book and said of it, the Margites is to comedy what the Iliad is to tragedy. The humor comes from the ridiculous situations that Margites gets into through his foolishness. It would remind you of no one as much as the great Lucille Ball. Suetonius, De Vita Praeclararum Meretricum, the lives of the famous courtesans, I think is best. It's a set of 12 biographies, very much like Lives of the Caesars, Lives of the Great Historians. He always wrote groups of 12. This was rather hot stuff. Even the Caesars had been pretty racy, but because this book includes the biographies of Cytorus and Laius and Aspasia and Thais and Rhodopis, it's not surprising that it did not survive the transition between the Roman religion and Christianity, not so much because it was sexy, but because it was about powerful women and it didn't stand a chance. This is my Aldine Sappho. I just got this. It's the Aditio Princeps. And her songs rank her with Pindar at the top of the list of Greek lyric poets. She was raised in Mytilene on Lesbos, but she was exiled to Sicily, and there she wrote more than 10,000 lines of poetry. By comparison, that's about 2/3 the length of the Iliad, so it's a pretty hefty work. She wrote most of it in her Sapphic stanza, and the influence that had was astonishing. It was used widely in ancient Greece. In Rome, Catullus used it in Latin. Horace wrote Integer Vitae is written in the minor Sapphic, and it influenced the moderns. Hardy used it, Houseman, Pound, Kipling. Allen Ginsberg wrote poems in the Sapphic stanza. She had tremendous influence, and all but a few fragments and one poem are gone. Now, this is a new book. This is Dorcas Hepopizouza, Dorcas the Lip-Smacking Woman by Alexis. Alexis was a Greek comic poet. He was said to be a great gourmand. He was absolutely rotund. It did not affect him much. He lived to be 106, and he died on stage receiving an award. Oh, please. His son, Stephanus, was a comic poet, as was his nephew, who was Menander. So it ran in the family. He wrote 245 comedies. There only tiny fragments survive, but the best title was surely Dorcas Hepopizouza. One of the most celebrated couples of all time, Abelard's poems for Heloise. He, the French philosopher, forerunner to empiricism. She, one of the earliest contributors to modern feminist thought. The story of their passion and their tragedy is intensely felt in these poems. The book did not survive the bonfires following Abelard's trial. And this is Shakespeare's Love's Labours Won. Written before 1598, it's the sequel to Love's Labours Lost, and it continues the tale. You remember the King of Navarre at the end of the first book, the King of Navarre and his 3 cronies, who are misbehaving fellows, but they've all become engaged to young ladies, and they're eager to marry. And the women are rather brighter than the guys, and they say, okay, but we're going to have, I think, a year of probation just to see how this works out. And so they were held to that till they could account to their intendants for their various infidelities and misdemeanors. Much hilarity ensues. The plays were given together until the second one was replaced by the somewhat superior comedy of Much Ado About Nothing. The play is not known to have existed or to have been given after 1610. Byron's memoirs. This is I only have five, I think, manuscripts in the collection. This is the most interesting of them. Byron said, and this is a quote, it showed the evils moral and physical of true dissipation. Byron wasn't fooling around when he was fooling around. It caused a big fight. He had ordered it to be burned after his death, and his publisher John Murray and his friend John Cam Hobhouse almost came to blows over this, because Hobhouse did not want to see it burned, and Murray felt that they had to obey Byron's wishes. They had a fight about it. In the event, it was burned by 2 of the servants in the presence of Byron's mother and Lady Byron, and both Hobhouse and Murray on Murray's hearth on Albemarle Street. Only 28 people got to read it. This biblioclasm has been called the greatest literary crime in history. I would have said 50 Shades of Grey, but so Hemingway, and Hemingway wrote his first novel, that's One Must First Endure. He wrote his first novel in 1922. He was living in Paris with his new wife, Hadley, and he went off to Lausanne to cover the peace conference. And he wrote back to Hadley and said, "Oh, you've got to come here. This is a great place." So she packed up her bags and went down to the Gare de Lyon and got on the train. And she jumped off for 1 second to get a bottle of water. And by the time she got back to her seat, the bag was gone, never to be recovered. The marriage didn't last. The title was Hemingway's motto, Il faut d'abord durer, and one must indeed. Now, these are books that were never finished. They weren't quite lost because they never actually made it to publication and they never were completed. And this, of course, is Kubla Khan by Coleridge. And this, you'll notice, is all 24 cantos of the poem. And you know the story. Coleridge was stoned out of his mind on opium, and he received in a dream this beautiful poem. And he woke with a start and ran to his desk and started dashing off the poem as fast as he could. And there was this fellow from Porlock who was there on business and kept him for an hour. And at the end of the hour, he went back to his desk and the poem had evaporated, except for the 54 lines of the fragment. This edition was published as a result of a wager between two inebriated printers. It was illustrated by Inigo Thomas, and it boasts a frontispiece by Florent Fidel Constant Bourgeois. It's a really wonderful edition. This is a comedy, Scorpion and Felix, by Karl, not Groucho, Marx. It was written by Marx at the age of 19, along with a good deal of romantic poetry, when he was studying law at the University of Berlin and running around with all the young Hegelians. It would remind you of Tristram Shandy. It would be interesting to know what the world would be like if this book had come to publication. Sad book. Sylvia Plath, Double Exposure. It's, in her words, this was a semi-autobiographical story of a wife whose husband turns out to be a deserter and philanderer. After her death, her mother and Ted Hughes traded accusations about the unfinished state and about its eventual disappearance. They actually wound up in court about it. Plath's typescript vanished mysteriously in 1970. The cover of this edition is really nice. It has that double portrait of Plath's young heroine, and it's striking because the right-hand picture is being blown away in the wind. Now, this wasn't actually written. It's mentioned in a letter. It's Aaron Klopstein's Shakespeare in Baby Talk, and it was probably a jest because Raymond Chandler wrote to someone and said he was going to write this. So we'll take him at his word. My copy is complete, but it's interesting. It's both unwritten and fictive. It consists of several essays and two of Shakespeare's plays written in baby talk, probably trying to outdo Charles and Mary Lamb, maybe. Of particular interest, I thought, was the essay on the play Asums Weixit. And then there are books that are just fictive, that are purely imaginary and only appear in some other book. This is one of the better known. This is the Reverend Edward Casaubon's Key to All Mythologies. Now, this is also one of those books that is unfinished and fictive. It's a massive an astonishingly boring book in which the author tries to resolve all known world mythologies in terms of his understanding of Christian theology. The book was edited by and not credited to his wife, Dorothea Brooke Casaubon. It's a distressing book in every way. This, however, is not. This is the Fairy Melusine by Christabel Lamotte, and it's from A.S. Byatt, Possession, of course. It's a series of exquisite poems in the pre-Raphaelite manner, and in it, in Possession, there are portrayed two young contemporary scholars. He is studying Randolph Henry Ashe, Victorian poet. She is studying Christabel Lamotte. And the two scholars, predictably, don't like each other when they meet. They rub each other the wrong way. But you saw that coming even before you opened the book. They dislike each other, but together they discover a number of wonderful things. The two Victorians had met, which no one had known. And they discovered that not only had they met, they had fallen in love and had an affair. And in the process of discovering that, of course, the two scholars do the same thing. So it's a charming book. But this is a very different kind of romance. This is Rosie M. Banks, the woman who braved all, and it's first mentioned in P.G. Woodhouse's The Inimitable Jeeves. It's a romance novel. It is often attributed to Bertram Wooster, but this is wrong. He did not write this. Rosie Banks wrote it when she was working as a waitress at the Senior Liberal Club in St. James, and it is mentioned in Woodhouse's book, is in the story, Bingo and the Little Woman, sick. By the end of the story, Bingo is married, Jeeves is wise, and Bertie is a fool. All ends well. Songs of the Jabberwock. This is, of course, the book that Alice finds when first she steps through the looking glass. And she turned over the leaves to find some part she could read. For it's all in some language I don't know, she said to herself. She puzzled over this for some time, but at last a bright thought struck her. Why, it's a looking glass book, of course. And if I hold it up to the glass, the words will all go the right way again. I'd like you to notice the tooling on this because I think it's really beautiful. Now, that does not appear to have been affected by the transmural retrieval process, but this is Shakespeare again, although really it's proto-Shakespeare, but let that go. It's the tragical murder of Gonzago, the Duke of Urbino, and I have to read this. A tragedy acted by Her Majesty's servants in the cockpit at the City of London and also in the two universities of Cambridge and Oxford and at Ulsan. What's that strange word? Elsinore, yes, I wonder what that is. It's the mousetrap, of course, and it allows Hamlet to convince himself that the king is really guilty of his father's murder. This plays the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. This is by Panurge, De la commodité des longues braguettes, on the usefulness of long cod pieces. It is a folio in vellum. It has 8 illustrations, 1 chart, and 2 cod pieces tipped in. Toni Morrison said that if you want to read a book and you can't find such a book, then you must write it. Panurge, finding himself caught short, needed this book, couldn't find it, even at the great library of St. Victor in Paris. So he sat his great self down and he wrote it. The cod piece with it there was found in the same box. We don't know if that's associated with the story or not. Now, there's a extravagant number of Dorothy Sayers books in this exhibition, and I need to probably defend that. After Rabelais, Dorothy Sayers is the best creator of imaginary books. And I could not help myself. I had to bring these. This is one, if you've read The Nine Tailors, you'll be familiar with this excellent little book on change ringing in country churches by the Reverend Venables. This is the first imprint of the text, and the copy bears the book plate of the library at Duke's Denver and was presented to Lord Peter Wimsey with gratitude on the occasion of his participation in a full ring of Kent Treble Bob Major at Fenchurch St. Paul. Now, shown with the book is a bell rope with its sally. Now, the sally of the rope is the colorful part that's wrapped around a section of the rope. And what that's for, it's very important. When you're ringing and the rope is sailing past you, you wait till the sally is there and you grab the sally. Because if you grab it before then, you can be pulled up into the roof of the bell chamber and have your skull cracked. So it's really critical to safe ringing. This is from the D note of the ring at Fenchurch St. Paul, which was frequently rung by the Reverend Venables himself here on the left. Here he is shown ringing Batty Thomas. And I cannot prove that rope is the same one, but it looks just like it, as you'll see when you go out there. This is notes on the collecting of incunabula by Lord Peter Wimsey. He was a member of the Roxburgh and the Grolier clubs in addition to the Bologna Club. And he assembled a truly exceptional collection of early printing in his digs at 110A Piccadilly in the 1920s. Now, this was begun as a sort of jeu d'esprit, and it was of extremely limited circulation, but the small volume has been highly influential among both scholars and bibliophiles. It was privately printed at Lord Peter's expense. I want you to notice, especially when you look at it in person, the beautiful arts and crafts binding and the funny way that one of the leaves is cocked off to the right, like on a whim. There's in it, we found the signature of Charles Parker, Wimsey's brother-in-law, is on the front free end paper. And this is Harriet's third mystery novel, Harriet Vane, Strong Poison. It was a hugely successful book because she was writing it at the time when she was tried for the murder of her lover. And she had just barely escaped with her life. But the publicity resulting from the trial made this a runaway bestseller. This is the first edition in its jacket, and this is a copy that was bound in poison. The green is arsenic and the red is cyanide, the red bubbles bubbling up through the pot. And we think it was made for the library at Duke's Denver for display, obviously, as a humorous birthday present for Harriet from young Lord St. George. And it would certainly have been disapproved by Uncle Peter. Now, Strand Magazine, the Sherlock Holmes of the Giant Rat of Sumatra, Watson's great story. This is the most famous of the unrecorded cases of Sherlock Holmes. The Matilda Briggs in this story is not the lady in question. It's the name of the tramp steamer out of Indonesia that brings the eponymous rat to London. The story benefits by wonderful illustrations from Sidney Paget, and it has that crazy belly band on the front of the magazine. And that's odd because it is not wrapped around the volume. It's printed on. They did another run through the press to get that on there because they thought this story was so critically important to get out. Now we're into some interesting scientific papers. This is speculations on the source of the Hampstead Ponds with some observations on the theory of tittlebats. Samuel Pickwick, Grand Chairman, member Pickwick Club. And this is the paper that agitated the scientific world and launched into renown the career of the immortal Pickwick. It is Mr. Pickwick's personal copy from which he read at the first meeting of the society that bears his name. The provenance is interesting. It comes through the descendants of a Mr. Samuel Weller. This is Thoughts on the Prevention of the Diseases Most Usual Among Seamen by Stephen Maturin. And Maturin was just an amazing man. He was a physician to the Duke of Clarence. He was a ship surgeon in the Royal Navy. He was a classicist, a naturalist, a secret agent for England, and a member of the Royal Society. His groundbreaking work on sailors' diseases brought practical changes to the life of the British tar. This, if you look closely, you'll see it has the original boards and metal furniture still intact, but the spine has been ripped off and was replaced with sailcloth, heavy sailcloth. We think about 1840. It has severe staining, probably from being in the surgeon's cockpit of a man of war. And its provenance is also interesting because it comes to us from the descendants of the loblolly boy of HMS Reliant. Found in the box with it was this skull, has an oval brass tag on the side that says Killick, which is curiously the same name as Jack Aubrey's disagreeable and recalcitrant steward. But it's doubtless a coincidence. Here's some more science fiction. This is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, published on Ursa Minor Beta, and consisting of a computer tablet with a massive interstellar infrastructure. This is the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom, the replacement for the out-of-date Encyclopedia Galactica, the guidebook for the entire universe, a client-server-based intergalactic Baedeker, the most useful book ever written, even when wildly inaccurate. Shown with it is a traveler's towel from mid-20th century Earth, which will have belonged to Arthur Dent. I love this. This is The Lady Who Loved Lightning by Claire Quilty, writing with Vivian Darkbloom. First mentioned, of course, in Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. Quilty was the author of this dark farce and a well-known writer of plays for children, was allegedly murdered by his colleague, Humbert Humbert, the unreliable narrator of the Book of Origin. Now, you see, in consequence, Quilty may not actually exist because we can't rely on Humbert's story. And if that's the case, this is the unique instance of an imaginary book being written by a character who does not exist even in the Book of Origin. And so it's doubly imaginary vertically. This is the Nymphs and Their Ways. It's anonymous, but it's an interesting book. It's one of the very few volumes published by Interkingdom Treaty in London, Paris, and beyond the fields we know. It was a highly prized collection of illustrated rondeaux, collected by an anonymous adventurer compiler in the early Renaissance. The poems are arranged in a charming and surprising set of tales of Arcadian legends from an anonymous French manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Frederick Marchmont's translations each face a photo reproduction of the French originals. And it's a very, very lovely book. Now, this is Abdul al-Hazred, the Necronomicon. It's first mentioned, of course, in Lovecraft's short story, The Hound. This is the most notorious of all the Middle Eastern grimoires. Legends claim that its use or even reading it will result in a horrible death at the hands of invisible monsters. Now, these days, of course, we know that such a thing, that's silly, and we don't have to have those kinds of fears. But for the last 50 years, this has been kept sealed in this Wells Fargo strongbox. It's the Greek edition. It's John Dee's copy. The further provenance is interesting. It was in Salem in 1632. Alonzo Typer had it until his sudden death in 1907. R.U. Pickman owned it at the time of the catastrophe of 1926. And it was at the Orne Library at Miskatonic University in 1930. It's been on permanent loan to this collection ever since the Crickle accident in the autumn of 1968. And this is a wonderful little book that it has significance beyond itself. It represents a whole library of imaginary books. This is L'Évangile de Citoyen Jésus, the Gospel according to Citizen Jesus. It is from the unique library of Jean Nepomucen Auguste Pichot, the Count of Fortsas, my arrière-grand-oncle. He was the legendary collector of singular books, and also the subject of that dreadful hoax in 1850. What you recall that all the book collectors and librarians of Western Europe received a catalog in the mail announcing an auction of these 50 odd books in a tiny town in Belgium, Banch, Belgium. And everyone ran off to this auction or sent representatives with instructions to absolutely buy at least one of the books, because it was almost as if the catalog had been constructed so that each person it was mailed to had a book on it that they could not possibly resist. They all got there and found out that unfortunately, the house where the auction was to be held did not exist, nor did the road that it was supposed to be on, nor did the auctioneer who was supposed to conduct it. And all that was there was a sign saying the collection had been sold to the public library, which did not exist either. So they trudged their way back to most of them to Paris and formed the Fortsas Club, about which more later. And this, I think this might be the last one. This is the, oh my, the Decretum Universitatis Parisiensis super Gorgiositate Mulier Calarum et Placatum, which is to say, the decrees of the Sorbonne on the liberty of décolletage in young women. And this comes from Rabelais, Gargantua, and Pantagruel in its Panurge's great work. So New Yorker cartoon, five years ago, maybe, there are two distinguished looking French gentlemen with plumes sitting at table, drinking wine with each other. And one says, "Ah, Monsieur Rabelais, there's just no word to describe that earthy humor of yours." Well, lacking such a word, the doctors of the Sorbonne were ill-equipped to confront the fullness of the problems staring them in the face. And although the investigation exposed matters to a discussion of the inadvisability of tight restrictions, the masters finally concluded that considerable further exploratory work remained to be accomplished. If you look at the collation carefully, you'll notice clues that the book is heavily extra illustrated. Vive la France. The Club Fortsas, which is the home of my collection when it's not traveling, is at 145 Rue Lafayette in Paris. It was founded in 1840 by 9 European bibliophiles on their return from that now famous Iter to Banch, Belgium, in the vain search for books from the Fortsas collection. It was named, of course, for the Count of Fortsas. The collection is normally on exhibition at the Club Fortsas. Of course, it's traveling right now. But this is very fortunate because the club is closed temporarily for the correction of certain ontological and existential deficiencies. And it can nevertheless be visited at clubfortsas.org. Gigi Duquesne, who is the president of the club, was so kind as to say, les livres imaginaires, comme l'on trouve dans la fameuse collection de M. Byers, sont à la fois bibliophiliques, superchériques, et pataphiliques, which is to say, these books are bibliophilic, deceitful, and beyond metaphor. And since you can't say any fairer than that, I would invite you to come have a look at the books themselves. And I want to thank you for your attention and your forbearance in putting up with all this nonsense.
Right there. They're right there. We have time for just a couple questions. So we'll start here in the room. Does anybody have a question? Alex.
Is there a catalog or is that also imaginary?
The catalog, unfortunately, is real, and it is it is for sale at Oak Knoll Press. There's a CR code in there that you can flash with your camera and get the link if you want to do it that way. We do not have copies here for several layers of reasons, but they do have them at the press.
Great question.
Great question. Thank you. Yes.
Carol.
Does the catalog include origin and finding and collecting information?
Yes. Don't trust the provenance, trust the description. Be skeptical of some of the printing information. But other than that, yes, it's all accurate. Yes.
Speaking sort of in the real world, how long did it take you to have these books created?
I do not know this world of which you speak. Yeah, this has been going on for, I don't know, 15 years perhaps. And it's one of those crazy passions that we get. And it's part the collecting bug, but it's also part the creation bug. And that's a dangerous combination to have in the same room. So yeah, about 15.
How many people were involved in creating?
There is a team of, I call them the book hunters, scouts, but their jobs probably give them away. One is an excellent bookbinder, Jeff Altpeter, who is, Jeff does facsimile binding for the Gardner Museum. They're understandably reluctant to put valuable books out, and so they often have him create facsimiles. And when I learned that there was someone like that, I went straight for it. I have a specialty calligrapher, a letterpress person, a black belt photoshopper, and a magician who work on the team.
Where's the magician?
Well, you'll see when you see the exhibition. Yes, only a little misdirection is involved.
Well, with that, we'll invite you to go look at the exhibition if you haven't had a chance to do that. But first, I ask you to join me in thanking our speaker, Reid Byers.
Thank you, Bill.
And thank you for joining us here in the club rooms and for joining us online. You can't see me. I'm a voice off camera right now, but thanks for joining us on Zoom.
Thank you for joining us on Zoom.
And you can register for any book club program online at bccbooks.org/programs. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll come again. And if you're here, please go take a look at the exhibition. Thanks, everyone.